Oh no! So my sound is off. Man, all kinds of technical problems today. All right. So I don't know what was going on today. I didn't get myself in the room. Didn't get the mic working. All right. Okay. Can everybody hear me now? All right. I see better. So I'm going to assume you can hear me. Awesome. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about moral relativism and some of the sort of rhetorical issues that I see surrounding how it's treated by people in both sort of standard online debates and sometimes in the literature, but more in terms of the debates that you see online. But I have a few announcements. And well, first I should say, well, welcome everybody that's already here. If you've got questions, throw them in there. I really appreciate those questions and I'll get to them when I can. After, if we get some more people in here, I'll go through and I'll say hello to everybody that I'm seeing in the chat. If whether you're new or you've been here for the past month since I've started the channel. If you are new or whether you're not, whatever, I'll say the same thing. I just started this channel up, and every weekend I think I like this time better. I was starting it at 9 p.m. and now I'm going to be doing them at 5 p.m. I'm going to be talking often. It's going to be an hour or two. It's usually somewhere kind of in between there, hour and a half or so. It might be shorter if I run out of steam or I don't have much to talk about. It could go longer if people end up joining. But what this is going to be my regular live stream where once people know that I'm doing this and they want to join in the live stream, I'm going to be posting a link if you want to join me and talk to me on StreamYard. If you just want to post questions in the chat, that's cool. It's just going to be my live stream where I'm just talking and it's more freewheeling. Now, I've been talking about some of my blog posts. My channel is also associated with a blog, which I started before this. I started that back in, I think, August or September. And basically what a big theme of my channel is discussing metaethics, and in particular, arguing about moral realism and anti-realism. I'm a moral anti-realist, and I don't think there's any good arguments for moral realism. And yet, for some reason, it's the dominant position among analytic philosophers, academic philosophers. It's over half of them. The last time there was a survey on this, and if you've already heard this, sorry, just there might be new people, I don't know. The latest survey of analytic philosophers from the Phil Paper survey, which if you haven't seen it, just look up Phil Paper survey 2020. You could Google that and you'll find it. And it's got a whole bunch of interesting results. They asked 100 questions to people about professional philosophers about their philosophical views, and you can get all the survey results there. So they found 62% of philosophers that responded to that survey endorsed moral realism. And I find this to be really strange. It would be like if 62% endorsed theism or other sorts of positions that I don't think I don't think there's good arguments or evidence for these positions. In fact, I think theism, there's probably better arguments for theism than I think there are for moral realism. And yet moral realism remains this super popular position, and it's on the rise. So there's been now two Phil Paper surveys, 2009 and 2020. And in 2009, it was 56%. So it looks like moral realism may be on the rise. Now, of course, you're not going to get this like perfect linear trend, but if we simplify and we say, okay, so it was actually 11 years, but let's say it's 10 years and it was 6%, but let's say it's 5%. So if there was a 5% increase in endorsement of moral realism among analytic philosophers, and that remains steady until by the end of the century, you would hit 100% philosophers endorsing moral realism. So if that trend continues, it is on the rise. And I think there's interesting questions about that. Okay, so anyway, today I'm going to be talking about some particular rhetorical and framing issues with respect to objections to moral relativism that I take issue with. I think that these are bad objections and often rely on misrepresenting and framing relativism and anti-realist positions more generally in a negative light. And that's something I'll get to in a little bit. But the first thing I should say is if you're liking this content and you haven't already, please consider liking the video. I see some people already liked it before it even started. Thanks for that. So subscribe. You could share it with people, tell people that I'm going to be doing this content regularly. And I should say, I have my first recorded discussion with someone else that will be uploaded to this channel probably this upcoming week, where we discuss, I think it's a couple hours long, where we discussed moral naturalism. So they're a moral realist that endorses moral naturalism. And you'll see a lot of my objections are to moral non-naturalism. So I thought it was a really interesting discussion. It wasn't so much a debate as more of an open-ended discussion. We got into some discussion of moral psychology. And you'll see that I take a different approach when discussing moral naturalism, and we reached more of an accord than I expected us to reach. And I really enjoyed that discussion. So you'll see something a little bit different with that. So it'll be my first recorded talk that will not be in place of these. I'm going to be doing these talks at 5 p.m. On Saturday, 5 p.m. Eastern time. Every single, I just noticed, by the way, sorry, I was distracted. Someone wrote sound independent. That's a good one. I like that. I'm going to put that up here. Thank you for that. I need that. There's going to be technical blips like that as I get things rolling on here. So I'm kind of slowly building up the content. So you will see that recorded talk. I don't know when we're gonna agree to post that, but I want to set it up as a premiere, so there'll be like a live chat, and if people are watching it live, they could hop in and make comments. So that'll be some new content. I'll also be rebroadcasting some of my earlier appearances. So I spoke with Rebecca from Bread of Life, and I'm going to be posting those videos on here. I'll probably just do one of those a month. I don't want to overload people with my content elsewhere. But if you're not aware of this, before I started this channel, I started making a bunch of appearances a little over a year ago. And the whole thing started when I saw some guests on the Bread of Life channel. If you don't know about the Bread of Life channel, you should go check that out. That's with Rebecca. And it's a channel for promoting Christianity. But she has a lot of guests on that talk about whatever, all sorts of topics. She's had all kinds of people on there and people with different perspectives. So I initially went on that channel to talk about moral realism. And in that case, I was responding to moral naturalism as well. So sometimes naturalism comes up. Oh, I should just say real quick, if you don't know what this distinction is. So there's typically one big division in the moral realist positions that are out there, and that's between naturalism and non-naturalism. So naturalists, very roughly speaking, are moral realists that think that the moral facts are reducible to or understandable in terms of, or are at least consistent with or fall within the scope of the natural sciences. And so often, again, to give a very simplified view, is they might try to identify moral facts with certain sorts of natural facts. For example, they might say moral facts are facts about what increases well-being and decreases suffering. And what well-being is like a psychological state. That's a thing people experience. So is suffering. Psychological states are like a real part of the natural world. We study them in psychology. It's not something that's only accessible to by a priori reasoning, or only accessible through divine revelation or some other sort of thing. It's something that's accessible to the natural sciences. And that's what naturalists will try to identify the moral facts with. So it's an attempt to render the content of moral realism, the facts that it's about, consistent with and within the scope of a naturalistic worldview in which, there isn't anything that's non-natural or supernatural. Non-naturalists, on the other hand, maintain that moral facts are not reducible to any particular set of natural facts. This, I don't know exactly I think that at least the terminology, but this distinction really came in force with G.E. Moore in the early 20th century, I believe, would be around the time. So a little over 100 years ago. And this distinction has sort of split off since then. And non-naturalists think that the moral fact, they don't think non-naturalism isn't moral supernaturalism. It doesn't mean that you think moral facts are facts about what God wants or something like that. Non-naturalists in the academic world are typically secular philosophers, although you could be a non-naturalist and a theist as well. It's not really about the theist atheist distinction at all. So plenty of them, especially many of the prominent ones in the field right now, are actually atheists. That is something to keep in mind. So most philosophers are moral realists and most philosophers are atheists. And I think the overlap there is big enough that you have a much bigger chunk of atheist realists than you have of atheist anti-realists. Not that many philosophers are anti-realists. Anyway, so let me have a look in the chat because I see a lot of text here. So I see Suzette, thanks for the question. So I answered this in the chat, but I'm just using the term metaethical relativism to distinguish it from other types of relativism. Nobody is ever consistent in the terminology. If you go and you look at the empirical work on metaethics, which there isn't that much of it, but it's only been around for about 20 years or so. There's earlier work, but it's sparse and it's diffuse. And like this becoming a really big research program is only fairly recent. And even then it's not that big compared to a lot of other areas of research. Anyway, people aren't really consistent with the terminology. I'm using the term metaethical relativism to distinguish the distinctively metaethical framing of relativism as a position from a couple other framings. So Sometimes, and this is a distinction I use, and I think this is, I got this from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral relativism, is that there's roughly, and again, this is not a perfect taxonomy because people use terminology in overlapping and confused and ambiguous and vague ways all the time. But here's one way of framing what we're talking about when we're talking about moral relativism, is that we could draw a distinction between metaethical relativism, descriptive relativism, and normative relativism. So I'll go over the other two first. So descriptive relativism is simply the descriptive claim that different people and different populations have different moral beliefs, values, or standards. So this would be the empirical observation that this group over here, they tend to think abortion is wrong, and that group over there, they tend to think abortion is not morally wrong. Or this particular group, holds one standard, this group holds some other standard. It could be anything. It can also refer to observations about individual differences between people. So Alex tends to think abortion is wrong. Sam tends to think abortion is not morally wrong. And so it's the observation that different people and groups have different moral differences. Different moral beliefs. Normative relativism, it's not even properly speaking, and neither is descriptive relativism really, but people frequently conflate the metaethical position with these other sorts of things. Normative relativism is this view that we ought to tolerate or be indifferent to or not interfere in instances in which other people individuals or groups have different moral standards. So this would be the normative view, a view about what you should or shouldn't do, or you could say the evaluative view about what it would be good or bad to do. That you should not stop other people or interfere if other people have different moral standards from you, as long as it's like a separate individual or a person from a different group. And it's like there would have to be some principal conception of, like, they're part of their group and I'm part of my group. And I have the view that as long as you're a member of that group, you follow one set of rules. If you're a member of my group, you follow a different set of rules. So you might be able to object to someone within your group from some sort of action, but not a member of outside that group. And so, an example you might think of is, well, within my culture, when when people die, you bury them. And in that culture, they cremate the dead. Now, within, I don't know, I'm in the United States, people can cremate or bury and no one has a strong attitude about it. But you can imagine a cultural context in which people moralize burial ceremonies and it's a really big deal. And they might think it would be terrible if someone from their own group didn't follow the customs of their group. But maybe they think of a person with a different group. Okay, well, if that's the way you do it, then that's the way you do it. Now, that's actually complicated because you could actually be a moral realist and just think that there's an abstract moral rule everyone should follow, which is you need to respect the dead. And then that just manifests differently in different cultures. And so that attitude is actually consistent with realism as well. But you could be a relativist about it and think, no, the actual action itself is right relative to my culture, but wrong relative to their culture, and vice versa for their practice. Anyway, I'm making this more complicated than it needs to be. Roughly speaking, there's these two different claims that are not metaethical relativism. Different people have different moral beliefs. That's not metaethical relativism. You should tolerate or not interfere in other people's moral practices or beliefs, and you shouldn't interfere in other moral culture, like the moral standards of different cultures or whatever. That's a normative claim, not metaethical relativism. Metaethical relativism is the view that moral claims can be true or false relative to the standards of different individuals or groups, whether you think that they're relativized to individuals or to groups or to both or to something other than an individual or a group, depends on the relativist position. It's often framed as though the only possibilities are that you relativize standards to individuals or groups. But in principle, you can imagine like a Star Trek situation where it's relativized to one galactic civilization and another galactic civilization. So humans follow this standard, and then, I don't know, Klingons follow this other set of standards. So you could relativize it to, different civilizations. You could relativize it to anything in principle. What unifies relativist positions is that they treat moral claims, the truth of moral claims, as having an indexical element to them. So what does that mean? Well, we already use indexicals. Indexicals are features of language that allow the truth standards to vary based on something about the context in which it's uttered or who's saying it or whatever. To give a very straightforward example everyone's familiar with, we use terms like I and me and you. And when you include those in a sentence, you can see how the truth status of a statement can vary based on who is saying it. So if I say, I am Lance, that's true because what I is referring to when I say it is myself. So I am Lance is referring to me. And it is true that I am Lance. But if someone who isn't Lance says, I am Lance, then the statement would be false. And so, and I guess we could set this aside now. One superficial and objection, and I have seen it numerous times over my life, is people will say moral relativism is self-contradictory. And the reason it's self-contradictory is that a statement like murder is wrong can be true and it can be false at the same time. Ergo contradiction, haha, position refuted. You can't have a self-contradictory position. That's absurd. It's not self-contradictory because it's relativizing them to different standards. That would be like saying because the sentence I am Lance can be true and it could be false, it's self-contradictory. So if I say I am Lance, it's self-contradictory? Of course not. Because when I say it, I'm referring to me, and if someone else says it, they're referring to themselves. So we already use indexicals. This is already a part of our language. And what relativists will say is that when we analyze moral claims, we're relativizing them, to our own standards or the standards of our group. And in that case, we already use indexicals. And it's just in that case that the indexical is implicit. So notice murder is wrong. It doesn't include I believe murder is wrong or murder is wrong inconsistent with my moral standards. It's not built into the statements that we ordinarily use in everyday discourse when we make moral claims. Implicit language that signifies that it's an indexical. And so you could add this extra layer onto relativism and say that it's a position that holds that there are implicit indexicals. So, and this might not be that unusual either. So if I go to a restaurant, I'm trying a new dish and I take a bite and I go, this is delicious. Am I saying describing some property of the food that is such that it has the property of deliciousness independent of my own evaluative standards or normative judgments? I could mean that. I could be a gastronomic realist and mean to describe it in that way. But I could just say, no, I'm just talking about relative to my own standards. But notice, this is delicious. I'm not saying I find this delicious or something like that. It's implicit there. And so what could happen is if you ask me, what do you mean when you say this is delicious? I mean, well, according to my taste preferences, this is delicious. It's not part of the sentence. Now, that might seem strange, but a lot of what people say in language is carried by the pragmatics of what they're saying and not the raw semantics. What I mean is that the context in which a sentence is uttered factors relevant to assumptions about the communicative intent of the speaker, the social situation that they're in, background assumptions, shared assumptions between them and whoever their interlocutors are. All of these factors can flesh out and add to the meaning of sentences. And so a relativist is not offering any kind of idiosyncratic or unusual account of language in general when extending their analysis to moral claims. So what this comes down to is that the relativist would say, okay, in a certain sense, we can translate a moral claim like murder is wrong. And we could translate it into a claim where we make all of those implicit features explicit. And you can see what the relativist is actually working with. So take the sentence, murder is wrong. They're saying something like, okay, here's how you would translate this. Murder is inconsistent with my moral standards, or murder is inconsistent with the standards of my group. Let's just focus on the my one because it's easier than constantly switching between group and individual. It could be either or. So that's one thing. The standards can be relativized to any standard in principle. You could even speak of standards being relative to like a book. You could say, murder is wrong according to the Bible, something like that. Anyway, so now you could see murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. Well, or I believe murder is wrong, something like that. There's multiple ways you could in principle translate it that would be consistent with relativism. You could see now, if it's actually true that murder is inconsistent with my moral standards, and it is, the statement is in a certain sense trivially true. It actually turns it into a kind of descriptive claim about the psychological status of the person making the claim. And in that sense, it's no longer especially mysterious what's meant by murder is wrong. If you're a relativist and you take murder is wrong to mean murder is inconsistent with my moral standards, that could be cashed out in terms of something quite ordinary and conventional that's not very much different from someone just telling you what food they like. Now, that's another important thing. I mean, I should really have more of a prepared list, but I'm kind of just going off the cuff here. But notice when I say that's kind of like when a person says that they think certain food is good or bad. This is another common thing that happens both, I've seen, among professional philosophers and non-philosophers. Let's say I make a comparison and I say that statements on the relativist view, like murder is wrong, share certain characteristics in common with statements like chocolate cake is tasty. So they're both true or false relative to the speaker, for instance. So people will often misunderstand that to be not only equating them in terms of the underlying presuppositions implicit in the statements. In other words, the sense in which the relativist is saying that both of them are similar is the sense in which both contain an implicit indexical such that the truth status of the claim is contingent on the standards of the speaker. That's the only sense in which they're being said to be similar. What it does not mean is that if you say murder is wrong is relative and chocolate cake is tasty is relative, that the speaker considers those two issues of equal importance, or they think that their attitude towards murder is as meaningless and trivial and something that they could overturn on a dime as their attitude about food preferences. So you could ask the relativist who says, look, murder's inconsistent with my standards, and I think chocolate cake is tasty. And you can say to the person, well, what if we gave you a pill that caused you to think that chocolate cake isn't tasty? Now you actually prefer vanilla cake more than chocolate cake. So if that were the case, the relativist might say, okay, go ahead. It's not that big of a deal. But if you said, well, what if we gave you a pill that now you actually think murder is great and you would actually want to commit murder or at least not oppose it? They might say, no, don't give me that. That would be horrible. So the relativist is well within, and it's first of all, it's totally logically consistent with relativism to have an oppositional attitude towards someone trying to change your attitude towards murder, but to be somewhat indifferent to one's change in one's food preferences. Totally consistent with relativism. Second, in practice, you'd probably find that relativists really would think this way. They care a lot. They don't want their moral standards to change, but they really wouldn't care that much if their food standards changed, other than perhaps for practical reasons. You wouldn't, if you're a relativist about food preferences, you wouldn't want your food preferences to only prefer really expensive things or really dangerous things or really unhealthy things, right? You might prefer to have certain preferences. Now, this is actually something I guess I'll just mention now, which is a common concern I have with the way that moral realists frame and object to relativism, which is that they will treat the relativist position like it's arbitrary, like it's flimsy. Well, oh, if you're a relativist, then if you thought murder was okay, then you just be okay with murder. Maybe you'd even go out and do it. If you're a relativist, then what's to stop you from just, changing your attitudes tomorrow? If your preferences change, then your moral standards change. And that's actually true for the relativist. If they think that their moral standards are just expressions of their preferences, then if their preferences change, then their moral attitudes will change and their behavior might change. Now, that's taken to be a very serious objection to relativism because it renders the relativist position in a certain sense unstable, or one might say arbitrary, or, you can't trust the relativists because what if they decide that they're okay with murder? And I've always found this to be a bizarre objection, as if one can simply choose to change their preferences. I can't choose to change my food preferences. They're not voluntary. I can't choose to prefer one thing over another. So if I like my coffee a certain way, or I like vanilla cake more than chocolate cake or whatever, I can't, it's possible for me to wake up tomorrow and have my food preferences change, but my food preferences are fairly stable. They changed during my childhood quite a bit, but once I was an adult, they were fairly fixed. They haven't changed a whole lot, and they're not under voluntary control. So they're both stable and the sorts of things that are not especially within our control. What realists I don't think have acknowledged is that there's a sort of parallel symmetry and an instability in their own views, which is that for the moral relativist, if their moral commitments are just going to come down to their preferences, then if their preferences change, their moral standards will change. Okay, fair enough. But we can ask, it's an empirical question about human psychology, how stable those sorts of preferences are. Maybe moral preferences are even more stable than food preferences. And as I'm arguing, food preferences are already quite stable. So this concern that moral relativists have unstable preferences and they might just become, pro-murder tomorrow, I don't think, how warranted is that? I don't think it's especially warranted. But flip this around. Since the moral relativist doesn't care about these objective moral facts, they don't believe in them, they might even endorse some kind of Humean conception of motivation where they say, look, even if I knew what the moral fact, even if I was wrong about relativism and I knew what the objective moral facts are, I wouldn't comply with them necessarily unless they were consistent with my standards. Now, strictly speaking, that's not relativism. That's a view about motivation, and that draws in a host of other philosophical assumptions. But keep in mind that, because unless you shifted their view to be an objectivist, and then you asked what they would do, then objecting to them on the grounds that if they're relativists, they wouldn't act consistently with the objective moral facts is kind of moot. So the objectivist, presumably to the extent that they are acting consistently with their moral standards, will, by assumption, act consistently with whatever they take the objective moral facts to be. And their beliefs about those objective moral facts could change. So that is something that's available that could cause the objectivist to change their behavior in potentially undesirable ways from some particular point of view in a way that's not available to the relativist. So if an objectivist becomes convinced that it's objectively morally acceptable to commit murder or whatever, then they might favor doing that. And this is actually an objection people have made towards moralization more generally throughout history, which is that what you can notice if you look throughout history is that it's not like everybody that's ever, done horrible things, tortured people, killed people, done terrible things, that they were like, ha ha ha, I'm a comic book villain and I want to be evil and I'm just going to do evil things. So I'm going to murder because I'm evil. Often people in these positions, if perhaps the majority or almost all, I don't even know the exact proportion, but it's quite common for the people committing horrible actions to consider those actions to be morally justified, permissible, even mandatory. And so the realist, if they're going to act with whatever they think the objective moral facts are, well, okay, what happens if someone convinces them or they come to believe tomorrow that murder's morally okay? Now, what are they going to do? Go out and commit murder? So again, that's not available to the relativist. And yet, what you'll notice with the dispute between realists and anti-realists is that realists will make a big fuss about the instability and arbitrariness and like, oh, you got to watch out for the relativist because if they just decide murder's okay, then murder's okay for them. Okay, well, if you just come to believe murder's okay, then murder's okay, according to you. So should we all be afraid of realists because they might become, righteously motivated monsters that are out trying to hurt people? Again, the degree to which individuals are motivated to act in accordance with what they take to be the objective moral facts, and the degree to which individuals are susceptible to changing their moral preferences while being a relativist are both empirical questions about how human psychology operates. And it's not at all obvious to me, and I'm not aware of there being a substantive empirical literature on this, that a person that's a really committed relativist is any more unstable in their moral commitments than the realist. And yet, what you see in these debates is a focus on the instability of the relativist and not the realist. I think that's really unfortunate, and I think it's a sort of unfair rhetorical strategy that's used to tar the opposition to realism. And that's the main thing I wanted to focus on today. But before I went in a long thing there, so let me look into the comments and see what else we got here. Okay, I see yo. Hi. Should we be hearing or seeing something? Yes, you should have been hearing or seeing something quite a while ago. Let's see, a bunch of people commenting on the sound. See a few other people. Hello. Hi to all the people here. Sorry, I'm getting to you like a half hour later after you're here. That one that we already saw, Sound Independent. Yeah, this person, I don't know how moral realism is a thing. I think that there are long historical and academic roots as to why it's a thing. It was probably fairly unpopular from what I hear from moral realists up until maybe somewhere between the 60s and the 80s. I think especially around the 80s it started emerging. I think I might have mentioned this in one of the papers I was reading. Is a big prominent paper. I think it's by Railton. That's like pretty much everyone's an anti-realist, but I'm going to make a case for realism. And I think that was in the 80s. So realism has been on the rise fairly recently within academia. All right, so let's look at a few questions just to give myself a break from the relativism stuff, and then we'll get back to it. Okay. How important is it to honor people's metaethical self-identification? Should we avoid saying divine command theorists are relativists if they don't like that terminology? I think we should, yeah. So if they don't take themselves to be relativists, I'm willing to take their word for it. Typically what I'd say in these sorts of cases is you might say, look, on my view, if you endorse this position, it may entail these sorts of implications. And so you could say something to divine command theorists, depending on exactly how they frame the position. You might say something like, look, your position commits you to the view that moral claims are stance dependent, like they're made true by the attitudes or values of some person or group. And in this case, that would be God. And the way I characterize relativism is, well, in fact, I wouldn't even characterize relativism in this way because I don't think it has to be, I think stance independence and relativism are different. So in that case, you might say, look, I consider views according to which moral claims, the truth status of moral claims are stance dependent. I consider those to be an anti-realist position. And so the way that I use the terminology, if you take divine command theory to entail that moral facts are stance dependent, then on my view, I would categorize that as a type of anti-realism. If you don't like that terminology, I don't think you're obligated to use it. And I'm not going to tell you you're an anti-realist if you really dislike that label. So yeah, I don't think we should be labeling people against their will, especially in a conversation. The problem might arise if you're writing a textbook, right, or a paper where you are trying to offer a formal characterization of these different positions, and a person's position just falls within the scope of that, and they don't, and it's like, well, given the way I'm stipulating how I'm using this term, your position is anti-realist, and they go, I don't want you to call me an anti-realist. In that case, I'm not like, consistency would require you to say, you know, they don't like the label, but according to the way I'm using the terminology, that's what they are. And one thing that might be nice in that case is to say that's not a term they would use to describe themselves, and they object to it. It would also be important, I think, in some cases, or at least helpful to know why they object. If they object because they prefer a different characterization, then you could just make a note of that and say, okay, well, according to my characterization, you know, that's what your position entails, and according to yours, it isn't, and that's fine. That's different. That if it's just a terminological or labeling issue, that's separate from whether a person, let's say it's a divine command theorist, says, look, I'm not a relativist, or I don't think moral facts are stance dependent. Or they could object. They could say, look, I don't think that stance dependence, stance independence is a good way of framing the realist anti-realist dispute. I think that the stance dependence should only be dependent on the stances of certain kinds of agents, and I think that God should be excluded from that. So that's, and then you could have a dispute about that. Now, I don't endorse that, and I'm just stipulating use for the sake of clarity in the distinction. So it's unlikely someone could persuade me, I mean, it's possible, that you should exclude God from that. So more like realism would then be anything according to which the moral facts are stance independent, or they are stance dependent, so long as it's dependent on God's stances. I see that as a kind of it's like a messy way. It's not a clean way of making the distinction between realism and anti-realism. And ultimately what we're doing here is just a terminological taxonomizing. So it doesn't come down to the substantive content of the positions. So that would be a dispute about labels. So one thing to get clear on is, do we agree on what your position consists of and what its entailments are? If they disagree, if they agree about what it consists of and what the entailments are, then you could have that dispute about what labels it's best to use to refer to it. And I wouldn't want to, in the middle of a conversation, say, I'm going to insist on calling your position this, even if you object. I think that'd be it's like unnecessary. And I think you should try to reach an accord, like, look, according to the way I use the terms, this is how I would prefer to. Again, the issue comes up in writing as well, where you don't have that person to give that feedback to. You could even make a general acknowledgement. I am using the terminology this way, according to the way I'm going to draw metaethical distinctions. If you think moral facts are made true by stance-dependent considerations, I'm going to call you an anti-realist, even if you're a divine command theorist and you don't like that. So you could just say that and then say, and some people object to this, and that's totally fine. So that's one thing. Then there's the consideration of whether they actually disagree either about what their position entails, or they disagree about the substantive content of your characterization of their position. And in that case, I think generally speaking, you should pretty much always defer to someone that's saying, look, you're not characterizing my position accurately. They might not like, you could be really strongly convinced you are characterizing it accurately. And there are circumstances where, you know, that might not be the case. Like if they say something and it's like very clear as an entailment, and you could disagree with them about what the entailment is, then you would have to have a dispute about whether or not their position entails something. What I wouldn't want to do is say, because I'm correct about what your position entails, and given that it entails such and such, it follows that your position would fall within this category. I'm going to insist in this discussion on referring to your position as though I've already won the argument. It belongs to that category. That's a little presumptuous. And so I think you should be a little more neutral. If they say, look, the disagreement needs to go one level up as to what my position entails. And until you've convinced me that my position entails this, which is what I'm disagreeing with. So in other words, like, let's say you're arguing their position entails X. If their position entails X, then it would follow the label, like it would be called a type of anti-realism. And they even agree, if my position entailed X, then it would be anti-realist. But they're saying it does not entail X. I don't think you should call the position anti-realist unless you convince them of that. Again, you have the issue of, well, what if you're writing about their position? Again, you might want to explicitly say the person that you're referring to disagrees. And again, it's also a matter of whether you're talking to a specific individual or you're talking about categories of positions. So that stuff gets really complicated. The social norms of navigating a discussion with a person differ from, like, if you're writing like a scholarly paper and you have to give some kind of formal definition. That's a whole thing. One thing I would say is that what I'm very much opposed to is when a person tries to tell another person what that person actually thinks. I really don't like that. So I have had discussions where I'm talking about a philosophical issue. I'll give an example. So I don't really have qualia intuitions. I don't have an intuition that when I see red, there's something it's like to see red. I see red. For me, this is all very deflationary. And there's not really an easy way for me I don't really know what people are talking about when they say, okay, it's not just that you're seeing red, and that's not just characterized in purely functional terms. There's a redness to the red. There's red qualia. Don't you have access to that? Or doesn't it seem like you have red qualia? No, it doesn't. And I've had people tell me, and someone could say, look, I think you do have red qualia, and I think you have access to them, but I think that you lack the introspective awareness to realize that you have access to them. Totally fine. What is not cool is when someone says, I don't think you're being sincere, or I think you're lying, or I think you're being disingenuous. I don't like those accusations outside strong evidence to support those kinds of accusations. Shouldn't be in the middle of a discussion telling someone they're lying to you. Because the issue is that, one, from my point of view, if I know I'm not lying, like consciously intending to deceive people, it's very frustrating to have a conversation with someone that's accusing me of that. It's just going to kind of, even if it didn't piss me off, it often does make me angry. Even if it didn't, how can you have a productive discussion with someone else if they're not taking your statements to be in good faith? I think the answer is you can't, because at any point, if you get the upper hand in a more contentious dispute, they could just say, you're not being honest about that, or whatever. So I don't think we should go after the person in a discussion unless there's substantive evidence to suggest that they're being disingenuous. Like if, I don't know, let's say one of their friends shows up and says, actually, they told me they were going to lie to you. And look, here's the text message where they said, I'm going to lie to Lance. Ha, 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 ha. Okay, well, now I have good reason to think that they're lying. They said they were going to lie about that specific topic. But outside of substantive reasons to think people are being disingenuous, I don't think you should do that. But I have had people tell me, you do think this, or this is your view. And that's not cool. You shouldn't do that to people. And I try to avoid doing that to others. So yeah, basically kind of one of my ground rules is no mind reading. Don't try to act as though you know what someone else is thinking better than they do. Typically, I think the norms of a discussion are, I tell you what I think, you tell me what you think. It's not, I tell you what I think and I tell you what you think. Because if I think I'm so good at telling you what you think, I don't even need to talk to you. I could just make up your position and talk to myself. Yeah, and so with respect to divine command theory, I'm not even sure that is a realist or an anti-realist position. I wouldn't call it a relativist position personally. So I make a distinction between relativism and relation designating accounts. So relativism allows the truth status of claims to vary, and it involves that feature in which they have an implicit indexical element. So, I am Lance can be true when I say it and false when someone who isn't Lance says it. And for the relativist, I think it's important to maintain that truth variable feature of moral claims. So if one person says murder is wrong, it could be true relative to their standards. And if another person says it's not wrong, that could also be true relative to that person's standards. For a divine command theory account, you don't have that indexicalization. If I say murder is wrong, it's going to be true or false. If God says it, if you say it, if anybody says it at any point in time or in any context, as long as the moral issue is sufficiently well specified, it'll be true or it will be false. The truth status can't vary. And so it doesn't have an indexical element. But it is true or false depending on someone's stance. And so I would see it as stance dependent and thus not a form of realism, but it's also not a form of relativism. Richard Joyce, in an old entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's this supplemental section that's really, really good. I think they removed it from the current version that talks about this. And there's one paper I found with this terminology that calls these relation designating accounts. So relation designating accounts allow for stance dependence without technically having a relativist component. So the relativism versus stance dependence distinction can come apart. Joyce also points out that technically you can have relativism without stance dependence as well. So in other words, you can have moral facts dependent on someone's stance without it being relativism. And that would be a case where There's one person to which all the moral standards refer to, or one standard, in which case they're all stance dependent, but there's only one stance, right? So stance dependent, not relative. You can also have relative but not stance dependent. And I think Joyce gives the example of tallness. So whether or not one person is tall or taller or less tall or more tall, it would be true or false relative to which heights you're comparing them to. But that's not made true by our attitudes or preferences. It's made true by features of the world. And so in that case, it'd be difficult to come up with an example for morality. But the point there is that relativism as a general framework where claims have like the truth status of normative claims could be relativized to one or another standard. That standard could in principle be a standard that isn't someone's stance. So then you would have a certain kind of you could call it like a stance independent relativism, and then it would actually be a type of realism. So technically speaking, moral relativism is consistent with realism. And it's just that in practice, almost always when people are talking about relativism, they are relativizing it to the standards of individuals or groups. In other words, they're relativizing it to some type of stance. And that's what makes it anti-realist, not the fact that it's relative. So that's a really good question. Okay. So I do see this more normative moralism. Do you mean normative realism seems to be self-contradictory? If you're still around, you could confirm in the chat. Let me know. I don't think that it's self-contradictory. If you think that it is, please explain in the chat why. I see this comment. I feel like moral norms are just strongly held social norms. Maybe that might be the case. I think things are a little more complicated than this. So within, I guess you could say, some particular weird populations, that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, there's this paradigm that's been used, which is the moral conventional distinction. So this is a research that was initially devised for assessing whether children drew a distinction between moral norms and social conventions, or you could say social conventional norms. And that was predicated on this, like identifying this cluster of characteristics that moral norms have that social norms don't have. And this would be things like authority independence and generalizability and what grounds or justifies them. And in the case of morality, it would be justified in terms of harm, justice, fairness, and not in the case of social conventions. So like the reason you shouldn't, leave class without asking the teacher. A lot of the questions are like that because it was designed for children. It's not like it's wrong because it's unjust to leave the room without the teacher's permission, but hitting someone might be wrong, or not sharing a toy might be unfair. So you would see this kind of a moralistic language in the case of certain sorts of violations and not others. That research, I don't know how well it replicates. There's been a bunch of studies on it, so it looks like it replicates fine, but it doesn't reliably emerge in every population or for every moral issue. So it's not a universal characteristic. So that distinction between moral and social norms only occurs in some populations and not others. More recent research that looks at how people from different cultures conceptualize the normative domain, like the whole class of normative concerns, this includes social issues, moral issues, other sorts of issues, shows that there's considerable variation. And this is true both cross-culturally and with respect to different religious groups. The recent paper, I think 2019, 2020, I can't remember the name of it, but they looked at how different religious communities conceptualize the moral domain, and they differed from one another. All right. What would you call the view? My belief or standards makes things good or bad. Is that? Yeah, that would be a type of relativism. That would be some type of appraiser, or well, that might be an agent relativism. It's not clear. So it would depend. It would depend on clarifying what exactly that means. That sounds like actually agent relativism. Yeah, this is a good question. So if I believe murder is both right and wrong, then would that mean that murder is both right and wrong? Isn't that then the contradiction your hypothetical interlocutor is worried about? I don't think that that's typically what people are worried about, which is that a person could have a self-contradictory position. I don't think that the relativism itself is subject to contradictions because a person within the framework of a relativist characterization could have self-contradictory positions. So, would we say that relativism, like claims about whether food is good or bad, being true or false only relative to different people's standards, that whole position makes no sense because a person could believe chocolate cake is both tasty and not tasty simultaneously and in the same way and at the same time. Therefore, and well, that doesn't make sense. So therefore, relativism about food doesn't make sense. Okay, well, if we want to say that, then what's the alternative? Do we have to be realists? So long as it's possible that a person could have a self-contradictory belief? I don't think so. So I don't think that the possibility of people's first order moral standards being self-contradictory impugns the second order metaethical position, which would allow for a person to have that sort of view. So I don't think that that really threatens metaethical relativism. And I don't think that that's the typical objection raised to it. If someone wants to say that that is somehow a problem for relativism, I should know I'm not a relativist. So one thing would just be to say, if you could refute relativism, I'd be like, okay, then it's refuted. So it's not, I don't have a dog in that fight. But I don't think that that does refute relativism. That's an interesting suggestion. You can't believe contradictions. Is it impossible to believe a contradiction? I'm not sure that that's true. Seems to me people can believe contradictions. Okay, well, Lance is saying is the position is missing an index. Well, someone could index two contradictory statements to the same standard. So I could say I am Lance and I am not Lance. I mean, are we going to, and keep in mind again, like, are we going to say that because a person could both believe that they're Lance and that they're not Lance, that therefore, like what? Like the indexical elements of self-references about one's identity is self-contradictory? And does this impugn second order claims about indexical claims about who people are? It doesn't seem like it would. It'd be kind of strange if that were the case. I think, in other words, I think that this kind of concern, this one here, would prove too much if that actually worked as an objection to relativism. I think it would start impugning a whole bunch of language in ways that would be pretty weird. These are awesome questions, by the way. I'm really appreciating these. Okay, let's see what else we got. Yeah, there's so many. I'm looking at the scroll bar and it looks like I'm only halfway through it. I don't get it. Won't that just be descriptive relativism? No. So the descriptive relativism is the claim that different people have different moral beliefs. It's not the claim that when people are making moral claims, that those claims are indexed to their own standards. So a moral realist that does not think that moral claims are relative could endorse descriptive relativism. They might say something like, look, this group over here, like my group, when we make moral claims, we have these certain moral beliefs. When that group speaks, they're referring to some other set of moral beliefs. They have different moral standards, but their moral standards are wrong and mine are right. So descriptive relativism is totally compatible with realism, whereas metaethical relativism that makes moral claims contingent on the standards of different people's, like different individuals or groups, wouldn't be compatible with it because it has that stance-dependent element to it. All right, I think I already addressed this. Yes, you could. And that is in fact what people do. I'm just going through, see if we got more questions. I think murder is wrong and right relative to my standards. Yeah, I don't. It's an interesting concern. Like, would that follow? I think it wouldn't. I think that person would just be making a self-contradictory claim. All right, going through. Looks like people talking to one another. All right. Lance, the objective moral norms always happen to be the societal standards of the time, like stealing is wrong. It seems that if someone believes that stealing is wrong, it stands independently true. They will be motivated to conform to it more. So I don't know if believing that a moral norm is objectively true or stands independently true increases motivation to comply with it. I think it's plausible that it would, but I don't know. That's an empirical question. What I don't agree with is the claim that the objective moral norms always happen to be the societal standards of the time. You will find moral realists, for instance, that endorse veganism, or you could take utilitarians when utilitarianism first rose onto the scene with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and others. They were arguing for rather radical reforms to the societies that they were in. And if one was arguing for those as a realist, then realism is consistent with, and there is historical precedent for it being associated with genuine efforts to engage in moral reform. So people were totally willing on moral realist grounds to go against the moral standards of their day. It doesn't always come down to social standards. I think it frequently does. And I do think that realists, I think that they're just projecting their own normative standards and values onto their realist framework. So they have certain preferences and values, and then they're imagining that that's what the objective standards are. And I think that the correlation there is very, very strong. But sometimes what they're imagining the correct moral standards aren't the same as the society around them. All right. See, there's a lot of comments. This is awesome. So much commentary. Let's see. Okay, people talking to each other. All right. Here's one that jumped out at me. What does qualia mean? I thought it was just experiencing things in your consciousness. So there's not a strong consensus on what's meant by qualia, and this isn't like a philosophy of mind discussion, so I don't want to get too much into it. So qualia are supposed to refer to the certain features of our subjective experience. So, or you could say properties of subjective experience, something like that. When people there's often a kind of Mott and Bailey around this terminology where people will say qualia, all that's referring to is subjective experience, or the quality of subjective experience, or something like that, in a way that's intended to be fairly theory neutral. And then the idea, well, nobody could deny that we have qualia because, of course, we all have subjective experiences. It's not like I don't have a cup here and that I have a subjective experience of there being a cup here. It's not just that there is a cup. I have an experience of there being a cup, and that's a subjective experience. So if you want to deny qualia, you're just saying people have no subjective experience. That's absurd. So of course there's qualia. But when you delve into what people are talking about when they talk about qualia, appeals to qualia are often used to argue against physicalism and to argue against various physicalist accounts and to argue in favor of certain sorts of metaphysical claims. And discussions of people that endorse the existence of qualia often reveal that the terminology is being used in ways where I can't remember. Dan Dennett ascribes 4 characteristics to this more substantive and robust use of qualia. And very roughly, the only terms I recall are private and ineffable, and I think maybe incommunicable. And I don't remember what the 4th one is. Let me look it up. We will get this. Ineffable, intrinsic, private. It wasn't incommunicable. So it's ineffable, and that, of course, just means incommunicable anyway. So ineffable, which is that they can't be communicated or apprehended by any means other than direct experience. Intrinsic, in that they are non-relational properties. I'm just reading off the Wikipedia page, which I think is, I don't know if it's quoting Dennett, but I think I've seen this elsewhere. Anyway, so ineffable, so you can't communicate them. Intrinsic, they're non-relational. They're private, meaning that it's only accessible to the person, and interpersonal comparisons are impossible. And they're directly or immediately apprehensible by consciousness. So this is what people are referring to. I think I take the more robust accounts to be referring to this. What for me is very important is that they're incommunicable. The content of them can't be conveyed to other people. And I don't think that there's any features of our experiences that are incommunicable in principle. It might be impossible in practice to communicate certain sorts of features of our experience, but I just don't think that there's this extra stuff. And often when I take these qualities to converge on is there being this additional property, this extra thing that's a feature of our experiences that falls outside the scope of what's accessible to the empirical sciences. And I don't think that there is anything like that. I don't think that there's this fundamentally unstudyable a non-empirical feature or property of our experiences. So I don't think there's anything like that. Okay, here's a question. Can you explain the difference between metaethical and normative realism? Yeah, so that's very simple. Metaethical realism is simply the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts. So that's the claim that there are facts about what's morally right or wrong, or is morally good or bad, that are true, independent of the goals, standards, or values of any individuals or groups, or any stances, really. So whatever it is that makes these moral claims true or false, it's not somebody's stances. It's stance independent. That's what moral realism is. Normative realism is simply the broader category that moral realism falls into. and that holds that there are stance-independent facts in a broader context. So normative realist is somebody that says like normative claims over some subset of possibly multiple normative domains likewise exhibit this property being stance independent. It doesn't mean that you think literally all norms are stance independent though. So a normative realist might say, look, I think moral facts are stance independently true or false. I think epistemic facts are stance independently true or false. But I think that aesthetic claims are only true or false in a relative sense. So if you're a normative realist, you'd say, I'm a normative realist about morality and epistemology or epistemic norms, but not about like gastronomic norms or aesthetic norms. So normative relativism is just the kind of umbrella term that says, okay, some subset of different normative domains, I'm a realist about those. All right. Also, it's helpful if you direct the questions at me. So when I go through and I see a big discussion with other people, I might miss a question in there if people are talking to each other. And then you throw a question at me and I'm kind of skimming through it. So you can use like, I don't know, the @ sign or whatever to make sure that I see that it's directed at me. Most of you are doing that. So I'm not objecting to anything, but I'm just reminding you to please do that. Okay. Okay, this is an interesting question, but it's not, I don't know if I want to digress to address it. So Lance, you can't believe contradictions. Like, how would you? I'm not sure it's literally impossible to believe a contradiction. We might have to have a discussion about what it would mean to have a belief. I mean, one thing is I don't know that people have introspective access to or awareness of even possessing two or more beliefs that entail things that contradict one another. So this is something that I think already falls within the scope of philosophy. I think there's a presumption that you can hold contradictory beliefs. I don't know if the substantive, like first order nature of the beliefs can be simultaneous. Like, I don't know if you could literally simultaneously entertain and hold two contradictory propositions at the same time. Like, can a person believe that that an object is both a square and believe that it's not a square, that they're currently looking at the object and believe both of those things? I don't know whether that's psychologically possible or not, but a person could have two beliefs that you could point out. Oh, hey, well, you said you believe this. You believe that, right? And they're like, yeah. And you're like, but you also believe this. Yeah. Don't those contradict one another? And they'd be like, well, how? And then you point out how they contradict and they go, oh, yeah, you're right. I guess one of them's got to go. And this is a whole thing in philosophy called reflective equilibrium, is that we can find when we introspect that our beliefs can be in tension with one another or conflict with one another. And to approach a state of reflective equilibrium is to identify these instances in which our beliefs are inconsistent with one another and resolve the inconsistency by abandoning or revising one or both of those beliefs in order to bring ourselves closer to having an overall sense of belief that's more consistent. And I think people have noticed, and like I've had that phenomenology, right? I've had that experience of someone pointing out, hey, you said this, right? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you think that? I'm like, uh-huh. And then they point out another thing, and then I realize they contradict each other. So I do think it's possible, because I don't think that we're always consciously entertaining all of our beliefs and all of our commitments and all of the entailments of those simultaneously. So it's possible that somewhere down the pathways of one or another of our beliefs that they conflict with others. In fact, I would pretty much guarantee that that's the case with our beliefs. So I think it's possible to have contradictory beliefs, but it depends on precisely what we mean by beliefs. If we're meaning like conscious occurrent mental states that are self-contradictory, maybe that's not possible, but I do think it's possible to have conflicting commitments. All right, let's see what else. Still more questions. This is amazing. I could just go off of questions for like an hour. This is really cool. All right. I see people complain about the relativism of undergrads. How are they diagnosing students as relativists? Is that legit? Does XFI do a better job of identifying relativist beliefs? This is actually something that I'm going to be talking about, I think, in 2 weeks, when I talk about one of the next upcoming topics are most people moral realists? But I could say a little bit about it now, because I'm going to be going in, a deeper dive into the empirical research when I do that. Okay, let me get a drink. I've been saying a lot. Oh, right. And to go with my image today, I had cookies. My wife made these, and I'm testing them out right now. And they're friggin' awesome. I love them. You could see they're baked just right. It's amazing. I was gonna do chocolate chip cookies because that's what we had in the picture, but we only had M&Ms, so M&M cookies. Okay, so hold on. I gotta finish doing this. Give me a second. Let me catch up with the chat while I do that. Awesome. Okay. Sorry, I don't want to be quiet for too long. It makes me uncomfortable. Whenever I'm in a discussion and everybody gets quiet, there's natural lulls. I hate that, and I want to fill them with conversations. Okay, so lots of questions here. There's lots of good stuff. So you do have this thing called student relativism, and this is something that people have noticed over the years, which is that in their classrooms, often with, I don't know if it's specifically freshmen or just undergraduate college students, it's probably predominantly in the US where I've heard the anecdotes about this. And I don't know what this looks like if you look at college experiences all around the world. That would be an interesting question. But within the US, lots of people have reported that many or most or even all of their students endorse relativism. So the question is, how are they diagnosing students as relativists? It's a good question. They might just be asking students if they're relativists, like using that terminology. They might be giving them scenarios like, hey, if there was this other culture and they practice this particular practice that we don't like, do you think that that would be morally wrong? And then the students say no, and you say why, and they go, well, it's their culture, and so they get to make the rules, or it's up to them. Or morality, they might say morality is relative, or they might say, what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you. And if they conflict with one another, oh well, different moral standards for different people. So how are they diagnosing them? Probably in a fairly informal and unsystematic way. This might be with a show of hands in class. It might be by giving them these sorts of scenarios, that sort of thing. Now, there's at least one big distinction to make, which is when you're asking students whether they're relativists in a class that is specifically designed to discuss the philosophy surrounding this, like, a class where you're talking about metaethics or you're talking about moral philosophy. And you might have a moral philosopher asking those sorts of questions. And moral philosophers might be better at framing, coming up with the sorts of thought experiments or framing the issue or, furnishing students with the appropriate terminology to adequately address these issues in a clear way. So that would be one thing. And then you would get the questions about relativism that occur outside those contexts. And your mileage is going to vary with how well it's going to be framed. There are certainly going to be instructors that are not teaching in a philosophy class that have a very good understanding of these concepts as they're used in metaethics and would have no problem articulating this to students. You might have others that might not be as familiar with some of the distinctions and might not be able to, for instance, draw a clear distinction between descriptive, normative, and metaethical relativism. So there might be a class where someone's like, hey, are you relativist? And then the students are like, yeah, different people have different beliefs, like descriptive relativism, not the metaethical view. And then they might go, oh, okay, so you're relativist, not realizing, okay, there's important distinctions that we could be making here. So that's a possibility, in which case you might get a potential misdiagnosis if that's then reported as though the students said they were metaethical relativists when all they were saying is that different people have different moral beliefs. So that's certainly a possibility. Do I think it's legit? Up to a point, yeah. So I've actually asked students this, and I had majority relativism in every class in which I've asked. Pretty much every time it's been the majority of students. And this has been multiple times. So students reporting being relativists is very, very common. Now, there is the question, okay, so, and this relates to this last question. Does XFI do a better job of identifying genuine relativist beliefs? Yes, it does. So the early work on moral relativism, there's a few stuff that goes back to developmental research with Piaget and Kohlberg, where there was some little bit of discussion about metaethics. I'm not that familiar with that, and I don't think that was as rigorous and systematic as I would have liked it to be. Maybe it's even better. I just don't know. So there's some older work like that. Then there was this ethics scale. What is the name of it? The ethics position questionnaire. And that uses a framework that looks kind of like metaethics, but I think that it's operationalizing the distinctions a little differently. So you could set that one aside. And there's a few older measures. The more recent measure that has been used the most frequently is called the disagreement paradigm. And what you do with that paradigm is you give people scenarios like this. Alex and Sam have a moral disagreement. Alex thinks abortion is morally wrong. Sam does not think abortion is morally wrong. Do you think that they could both be correct? Do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? And then if they say they could both be correct, you interpret that as as relativism, or at least non-realism. And if they say at least one has to be incorrect, you interpret that as realism. And that's been used to identify whether the participants endorse realism or not. That measure can be framed in ways that can be, one, it's restricting the response options to just one realist and one anti-realist position. Two, realist and anti-realist positions are potentially compatible with giving the other answer. So for instance, let's say you're a cultural relativist and you think that two people are both members of the same culture and they have conflicting moral claims. Well, now you're going to think one of them's got to be wrong, even though you're an anti-realist. So right there, and that hypothesis was actually tested. There's a paper called Folk Moral Relativism. And what they do in that paper is they have the participants compare the views of a member of like their class or their university or whatever to, I think they have them compare themselves to one of these people or one of these students to someone else. I can't remember the exact comparison offhand. Anyway, what you get are three different types of comparisons. Two people from the same culture, two people like on Earth, then two people from different cultures on Earth, and then one person on Earth and an extraterrestrial civilization where they make it a little silly. They're called pentars, and they want to turn everything in the universe into pentagons, and they don't care about love or concern for others. And what you get with those is that disagreement question. You get increasing agreement that both people could be correct. For that, it wasn't a dichotomous choice. I think it was a Likert scale with how much you agree that if both people hold the position. I don't remember if they asked that at least one is to be incorrect or whether they could both be correct. Anyway, that used a Likert scale. If you're not familiar with the Likert scale, that's those kind of scales. Some of you have, in fact, probably everybody here has filled out at least one survey where it's like 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, where it's like 1 strongly disagree, 10 strongly agree. And then you could calculate the average score that people give for that, which might be like a 4.3 or a 5.6 or whatever. Anyway, what they found for that is that if the two people were from the same culture, you get the lowest level of relativism. If they're from different cultures, you get higher relativism. And then if it's a person from Earth and an extraterrestrial civilization, you get the highest level of relativism. And that suggests, it could be that what's going on is that when people are made aware of the fact that the two different moral standards are referencing different cultures, they're more likely to judge that both people could be correct, which could be an indication that people are more likely to be moral relativists than even the early studies picked up on, which already had fairly high levels of relativism depending on the moral issue. So it's possible that lots of students are moral relativists. I'm not entirely convinced of that because I think that ordinary people's way of thinking about metaethical issues isn't super duper clear. And I think that there's a lot of entanglement with normative considerations and epistemic considerations and social considerations and descriptive considerations. So what I mean by that is that I think a lot of people take relativism to entail a more tolerant or accepting attitude of people from other cultures. And if you were to express realism, you would be expressing a kind of intolerance or hostility towards people with different standards or beliefs and values that a person doesn't want to convey. And then you're going to say, I'm a relativist because you don't want to be a jerk. And if that's the case, and I think it is probably the case for a substantial portion of what's prompting people to give relativist responses, then their responses are not reflective of what you could basically say, if you isolated out the metaethical component, I'm not sure how many would endorse that without the spillover into these other sorts of considerations. In other words, I think a lot of people are saying, basically, I want to be tolerant to people with different values and beliefs than me. I don't want to be an asshole towards other people. I don't want to feel that I have to bulldoze other people's cultures and values and impose my standards on them. That's what I think a lot of people are ultimately trying to express when they express those views. So there's that. And then there's also just, I don't think most people conceptualize relativism in as stark and clearly delineated a way as to treat relativism as the view that moral claims are best understood as expressions with implicit indexicals in them, such that the truth value can vary in accordance with the speaker or the standard of the speaker or the standards of the speaker's culture. I don't think people think of relativism that way. I think it's a lot looser and has a lot of like sort of bleed over and spill over into other sorts of concerns and distinctions. So I'll get more into the X-Fi stuff when I talk about that in a couple weeks, because that's a big discussion that I can't spend a ton of time on now. All right. What else do we have? All right, here's another one. Do you think that depending on where you fall metaethically, normative ethics can sometimes seem redundant? Yeah, probably. So you could have some certain, like a really strong kind of nihilism where you just say there's nothing, there are no moral properties or values, and so morality is pointless. Something like that. I don't know how, like, it's possible to have a meta-ethical view that has certain sorts of entailments for what kind of content is available to you in your normative position. I don't think that that's necessarily true of anti-realism as a category, though. So I don't think if someone says, I'm an anti-realist, that entails anything about their normative commitments. But if they say, I'm an anti-realist that endorses this specific view, it's possible for it to have normative implications. I think that might also be true of realists as well, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Yeah. Could you say something about why the realism anti-realism debate is rotating? It seems like but people are wrong on the internet. So my interest in this did not arise from internet disputes. It arose from studying this in university. I was in graduate school studying philosophy, and that's when this issue came up. So I talked about this last week, where it came up in a dispute between Richard Joyce and Stephen Finlay. So one is an error theorist. I think one is some kind of speaker relativist. I don't know exactly what Finlay's view is or whether it's changed or anything like that. But that dispute interested me, and that's how I got into this. So you could see it as a kind of dry and pointless academic dispute if you want. So there's that. I don't think it's just people arguing on the internet. Also, it's not that many people arguing about this anyway. So why is this worth taking seriously? Well, I'm a quietist about this issue. So I don't think it's worth taking seriously. There's a kind of second order way in which I take it seriously because I don't think it should be taken seriously. For comparison, imagine if half of the chemists out there were in favor of like alchemy or something, or half the astronomers were doing astrology and numerology. And as a result, let's say you really wanted astronomy to go well. You thought it was important for us to do astronomy because it helped us understand fundamental physics and cosmology, and it could help with developing technologies to build a better theoretical understanding of the fundamental nature of the universe, yada, yada, right? So that's your view of why astronomy is important. And imagine half of the professional astronomers were, astrologers or numerologists, and that was undercutting the ability for us to do astronomy effectively and productively. If you thought that, you might jump into the debate, and rather than focus on new telescope technology or finding new exoplanets or something like that, you focused on that dispute and try to convince people, hey, this particular position, this astrology stuff, this is nonsense. We should stop doing astrology. Someone might come along and say, and someone could say, why? And you go, well, it's important for us to understand how the universe actually is and how it actually works. And we're wasting huge government grants to fund people doing astrology. And astrology is like pseudoscience, doesn't even work. We're wasting the money. We need to stop doing this. And someone could come along and go, well, why do you think it's important to argue about astrology? If astrology is so nonsensical and pointless, why argue about it? What's the point? And that would be weird because it's like your whole point is we shouldn't be arguing about it. You're arguing to try to convince people to stop investing in it. So you can see the argument as valuable insofar as you want one of the sides to win and the other side to quit. So you can get on with the business of doing astronomy proper, right? So that is how I view a lot of disputes in philosophy. And it might not be that I want one or the other side to win. So like free will would be an example. I don't even think there's a winner here. I think that the whole discussion it just comes down to conceptual and linguistic confusions. And like, I just want the discussion to stop. And so I enter the discussion in order to say, hey, this is a pointless discussion. So it's weird when someone raises the concern from me. Why are you talking about this? This seems like a pointless thing. And it's like, well, that's why I'm talking about it. So it might seem paradoxical, but I don't think that it is at all. So that's why I think this is important. I don't think there are substantive implications, like practical implications for realism or anti-realism. So but I think realists think that there are. So that's an argument I have to have. But note that that's a second order argument. I have to argue with people about whether there are important implications of this, and I don't think that there are. So one implication, so you could say, it, again, sort of almost paradoxically, it's not really a paradox. I think one important implication of metaethics is that it doesn't have important implications. And therefore, discussions that presume that it does have important implications are misguided and wrong. And those positions should be argued against. All right. I think I'm almost caught up. Okay, so you say you're a moral nihilist. I'm curious exactly what you mean by that. I think nihilism should be called realism. Why? Why do you think it should be called realism? How is realism like astrology or numerology? Um, I don't know that realism necessarily makes our practical lives go worse. It might just have little or no substantive impact on it at all. Uh, so the only sense in which I'm comparing it to astrology or numerology is only in the sense that I think that the positions are not correct, and I think an emphasis on discussing those positions rather than discussing some, I guess you could say, closely related considerations. I think that closely related considerations, it would be productive and useful to talk about those, but we're not talking about those because people are still talking about realism. Astrology and numerology might in practice have significantly more harmful consequences than realism. So I'm not comparing it in that respect. So yeah, it's basically what Wittgenstein was doing with philosophy writ large. That's exactly right. Yeah. So the approach that I'm taking here is very much Wittgensteinian. In fact, I have a couple. I just got. I'll show this here in the mail today. I got. Oh, that's not it. Here it is. The Wittgenstein Blue Book and Brown Book. All right. So, what else we got here? Nihilism should be called realism because it's the default positions human make up rules for action. Well, humans make up rules for action. Maybe you could call yourself a constructivist. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't want to try to use that term realism because I think realists have, I don't know, soiled the term already. So I've floated some possibilities, and basically I think that if we cleared away the realism anti-realism dispute, we could then talk about like what actually is the subject matter of moral philosophy. And I see it largely as a matter of working out the best principles for negotiating what to do given the fact that people have conflicting goals and values. And then considerations like game theory and optimal negotiation and factors that bring in empirical facts about human psychology or the psychology of possible agents we could encounter, whether it be AIs or aliens or whatever. All of that, we could start discussing that and working on what would be the most effective ways of navigating the fact that we have differences. What principles and rules are what kind of meta morality or meta normativity, like what principles would allow us to negotiate those differences? I think that there's interesting questions to work on there. And I wish we had more people working on those, but we're not because we're buried in these disputes that I think are rooted in like the theological influences on moral thinking and, Plato's influence with, weird metaphysics, stuff like that. And I think that that's had a negative impact on the way that people engage in these sorts of disputes. And I think more philosophers should take the later Wittgenstein very seriously and realize that a lot of the disputes that they're engaged in are probably quite empty. Okay, so that has me caught up. So I want to say a few things about relativism more generally. And I guess the first thing, again, to emphasize, I'm not a moral relativist. I don't have so I'm an anti-realist, and I don't tend to have my position fall within the typical categories because I think that all those typical categories rely on these substantive claims about like the semantics of everyday discourse, and I don't really endorse any of those. But I do think that a few things worth noting. One of them, and this has already come up a little bit, is this concern that this just seems like a dispute on the internet. However, a lot of the dispute about metaethics actually occurs in academic contexts, and there aren't a lot of players in these discussions, and certain sorts of figures tend to dominate in the discussions in any given period of time. So there, certain like Mike Humer, Richard Landau, Richard Joyce, certain sorts of names, if you study metaethics academically, will pop out as there being lots of papers and lots of discussion about them. And I think that while there is a world of these sorts of online disputes, that the prominence of certain sorts of figures can trickle into and influence the way that the online discussions go. But I also think that there's a sort of feedback loop between the academic discussions about metaethics and the popular discussions about metaethics. And I think that the sort of prevailing zeitgeist, the prevailing attitudes in society or in academia or in philosophy in particular, influence the structure and nature of the ongoing disputes within metaethics at any given time academically. But I also think that so like let's say a particular paper snowballs and gets really, really prominent. One example of this would be Sharon Street's paper. I think it's called like a Darwinian dilemma. Anyway, it's a paper that really popularized this notion of evolutionary debunking arguments. When that paper came out, first of all, that is a freaking awesome paper. It's a long paper. It's worth the read. It's just super cool. I love that paper. That paper got a lot of interplay and feedback, and people just really dove in and sunk their teeth into that. And evolutionary debunking arguments became the rage in metaethics for a while. I think that started to die down a few years ago, but back about 10 years ago, is just all anybody was talking about. All this everybody threw their hat in. I have a paper on evolutionary debunking arguments. Everybody does. So that became really popular. Now, I think rightly so, because it's an interesting topic. But what you could see is, what if Street hadn't published that paper? Okay, then we wouldn't be talking about that. And so the sort of to a certain extent, or what if that just didn't become popular and someone else wrote another paper and that paper became popular? Papers, in a certain sense, they don't go quite as viral as a video can, like a cat video or something like that. But the sort of certain chance elements can influence the way that certain sorts of discussions end up going. I don't know if Street hadn't published that paper, if someone else would have published an EDA paper, and just the culture of metaethics was ready for this kind of thing. I don't know if that's the case. It's a difficult sociological question to assess. It might not be accessible. So there's these sort of sociological factors are in play in which particular issues become prominent or not. And this relates back to this, what I mentioned at the start of this, which is moral realism has been on the rise. And I'm not sure if that's, you could say, oh, well, that's an indication that moral realism is true, but I'm not so sure that it is. I think that the popularity and trends within analytic philosophy might be driven by sociological forces that are not all that truth tracking. And it could just be which particular professor lands the right kind of job or gets a paper published in the top journal or happens to have that paper go at least sort of within, like viral within the academic community. So all of these factors could be in play. There's like a stochastic element to it and a chance element to it that influences what papers happen to become popular. So no matter how good a paper is, it could be the greatest paper in the world. And it could be, right now, for instance, there could be an amazing paper by a moral realist that is not taking the academic world by storm, or an amazing paper by an anti-realist or whatever. And it's just not getting the attention that it should. And only sometimes do papers get picked up and become really popular, like the EDA stuff. So sometimes that happens, and it could have just not happened, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe there is an inevitability here. Maybe if we knew exactly what forces were at work, it wouldn't be inevitable. I don't know. However, what I should say is that when you look at the published papers for arguing for moral realism or against anti-realism, they're often cautious and careful in a way that I think masks some of the rhetorical and polemical stuff that you'll see outside of those academic contexts. And I've seen both professional philosophers and non-philosophers make critiques of relativism that I think are not particularly good. And part of this, I think, relies on framing and rhetorical moves. And a couple things to note. One of the rhetorical moves that's made is to imply that if you can refute relativism, this significantly bolsters the case for realism. And I don't think that doesn't follow. Because what if error theory is just obviously true or something like that? If we had all the right facts, we just know error theory is true. Making a case against relativism would be moot, because the correct anti-realist, like an anti-realist could just say, yeah, I agree with you, relativism is wrong. So one of the rhetorical moves is to say, if I could defeat this position, my position is correct. And in fact, like when Mike Huemer talks about this, the way Huemer frames the issue is Huemer says, look, if you're a realist, you can be a naturalist or non-naturalist. If you're an anti-realist, there's only three possible positions: error theory, non-cognitivism, and relativism. And so it follows that if you refute those, then realism is true. And so Huemer explicitly frames the scenario as one in which if you can refute all of the anti-realist positions, realism wins. Now, if it were true that your only options were some type of realism or some type of anti-realism, and there's only three possible kinds of anti-realism, and all three are false, yeah, okay, then you get realism. So like if you have it, in other words, a true dichotomy, if it really is mutually exhaustive, it's A or not A. And that's how humor frames that. Now, I would buy that if I bought the framework itself. I don't think those are the only three anti-realist positions that are available to us. So I don't really accept that framing. But so that's one issue with this, is that the dispute between realists or anti-realists is framed in a way where if I can knock down the anti-realist positions, realism wins. But often the subtext is if I could knock down relativism, that somehow substantially makes a case for realism. And then there's these, you see these critiques of relativism. But the main issue I wanted to bring up is this issue, and I think I've talked about this in previous videos, is a distinction between appraiser and agent relativism. And a lot of times what you'll see is the way that people will talk about relativism, and they'll say things like this. And I've seen this from philosophers. They'll say, "Okay, well, I had a student," and I think I might have already talked about this, but whatever, I like it, so I'm going to talk about it again. Okay, so a student turns in a paper arguing for relativism. Professor writes F on the paper. The student goes, "What? You can't give me an F on the paper. It's a good paper." And the professor goes, "Not if you're a relativist. If you're a relativist, I can do whatever I want. You can't object." That's nonsense. That's not an implication of relativism. So often objections to relativism are objections to agent relativism in particular. So what distinction am I drawing attention to here? There's a distinction between agent relativism and appraiser relativism. Agent relativism holds that an action is morally right or wrong so long as it's consistent with the standards of the agent performing the action or the standards of the culture of the agent performing the action. For example, if a person thinks that murder is wrong and then they go out and they think murder is okay and they go out and commit a murder, if you're an agent relativist, you would say their action was not wrong. And it wouldn't be wrong from my point of view or your point of view or anybody's point of view, because what fixes whether it's morally okay for that person to murder is whether they think it's okay for them to murder. And so if they commit a murder and you're an agent relativist, you'd have to go, yeah, it was morally good or at least morally permissible for that person to commit a murder. So basically you think that each person's actions are right or wrong so long as it's consistent with that person's standards from your point of view. So it's the agent standards that fix the actions or the standards of that agent's culture. But an appraiser relativist doesn't have to think this. The appraiser relativist would say, look, what matters is who's making the moral judgment. So if a person thinks it's okay for them to commit murder and then they go and commit murder, then it would be okay for them to commit murder relative to their standards. But that doesn't mean that you have to take any particular stance towards that. It could be inconsistent with your attitude. It could be inconsistent with your standards that murder is wrong. So now what we would say is, if you're an appraiser relativist, the person performing the action, of course, can appraise their own actions. So the person that thinks it's okay to murder and goes and murders, murder wouldn't be wrong relative to their standards, but it could still be wrong relative to your standards. And there's no contradiction in you acting consistently with your own standards. So appraiser relativism does not logically require you to tolerate or accept or not judge the standards or behaviors of other people and other cultures. It is not an entailment of appraiser relativism, because an appraiser relativist could say, look, if that culture thinks it's okay to torture babies or whatever, fine. It's true relative to their standards that it's okay to torture babies, but it's not true relative to my standards, and I'm going to go stop them torturing babies because I'm against that. No contradiction there. And this, in fact, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral relativism says, hey, this is the more common of the two positions, and this will be the one assumed throughout this discussion. In fact, let me bring that up just to really bring this point home, that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you're not already aware, is this prominent source that's used in philosophy, where it's not a published peer-reviewed journal, but it's this respected place where different authors are end up writing within their areas of specialization on particular topics. And it's this freely available online encyclopedia. So let me bring that up. Give me one moment. And I've already got it. I am going to pin this in the chat. Here it is. And now it's pinned. And if you go to section 2, forms and arguments, and you go down to, let's see, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph, you will get this line. Third, That to which truth or justification is relative may be the persons making the moral judgments or the persons about whom the judgments are made. These are sometimes called appraiser and agent relativism, respectively. Appraiser relativism suggests that we do or should make moral judgments on the basis of our own standards, while agent relativism implies that the relevant standards are those of the persons we are judging. Of course, in some cases, these may coincide, as I said. Appraiser relativism is the more common position, and it will usually be assumed in the discussion that follows. No, it's appraiser relativism. So my point here is that many of the most common objections to moral relativism only talk about agent relativism and then say, well, relativism, if you're a moral relativist and someone else thinks it's okay to torture babies, or some culture thinks it's okay to torture babies, you have to think it's okay for them to torture babies. That's only true for agent relativism. It's not true for appraiser relativism. So the state, and what I don't like about this is that these are professional philosophers making a criticism of relativism that are not disambiguating agent and appraiser relativism, and they're implying relativism commits you to the view that when other people torture babies, as long as they think it's okay for them to do it, you have to think it's okay for them to do it. That's false. That is not an entailment of relativism. You don't have to think it's okay for other people to torture babies just because they think it's okay. That would only be true on particular conceptions of relativism. And note what this article says. It says, again, appraiser relativism is the more common position. Now, I don't know what they're referring to. That's a little vague. More common position among analytic philosophers, among lay people. I don't know exactly what they mean by that, and they don't provide any citations or references to support the claim that appraiser relativism is the more common position. So I don't know exactly what they mean, and I don't know if that's true. But it certainly is within the available conceptual space for the relativist to endorse appraiser relativism. And then one of the most common objections to relativism simply does not apply to this form of relativism. And again, the SEP entry says it's the more common form. So it's a little puzzling. Like I don't put that much stock in what the SEP says on the matter, especially because I don't think it's sufficiently clear what exactly the claim is. But it's a little strange to object to a subset within a position as though you're objecting to the whole position. That doesn't follow. Refuting one type of relativism doesn't refute all types of relativism. And yet, you will frequently see, again, not just non-philosophers, but professional philosophers will say relativism requires you to believe that if some culture or individual thinks it's okay to torture babies, you have to think it's okay to torture babies. Or they might say, if a person thinks it's okay to torture babies, then it's good for them to torture babies. That's even worse. So you could disambiguate that statement. So let's say you're a critic of relativism and you say, okay, well, if relativism were true, then because there are cultures and individuals that think it's okay to torture babies, we have to think torturing babies is good. That's the kind of objection that you'll see. Now, that could be disambiguated in at least three ways. One way is in the agent relativist way. So the objection there might be, if you want to endorse relativism, you're committed to the view that if someone thinks it's okay to torture babies, or if their culture does, then it is good for them, or it's right for them to torture babies. And you would have to be committed to that. And again, that would be true if you're an agent relativist. So that would be one way of characterizing the claim. Another would be the appraiser relativist way, where if some culture thinks that it's good for them to torture babies, then it's good for them to torture babies. Now, if you say that, that's not true or false for the appraiser relativist because it's ambiguous. It's basically too underspecified to evaluate. Because if you're an appraiser relativist, you don't believe that things can be good or bad in an unqualified sense. So it's not true that if some culture or person thinks it's good to torture babies, then it's good to torture babies. Because that second instance of it's good to torture babies, what do you mean by that? Do you mean relative to their standards or my standards, or which standard are you relativizing to? It's no longer clear which standard it's being indexed to. And once you make clear what the standards that are or could be indexed, then the statement is not true or false in an unqualified sense. It's simply underspecified. And so if that's the case, then this common objection to relativism, if the person's an appraiser relativist, is mischaracterizing what the appraiser relativist is committed to. They're not committed to thinking that it's good. They're only committed to thinking that it's good relative to the standards of those that think that it's good. And they're not committed to thinking it's good themselves. And so this objection to relativism exploits what I take to be an ambiguity in saying, if you're a relativist, And if a culture thinks it's good to torture babies, you have to agree that it's good to torture babies. No, you don't. Because that second use of you have to think it's good to torture babies has to unpack that. It has to disambiguate what that means. If they're saying you have to think it's good because moral standards are set by the actions the agents perform, or the standards of the cultures of the agents performing the action, you could say, no, I reject that because I'm an appraiser relativist, not an agent relativist. So that's false. I'm not committed to that. If you're an appraiser relativist, you could say, well, hold on. I'm not committed to the notion that it's good for that culture to torture babies. What I'm committed to is only that whether or not the statement it's good to torture babies is true depends on which standard it's being indexed to. And it's completely consistent with believing that to also believe that it's wrong to torture babies because it's inconsistent with your standards. So you have to disambiguate the metaethical claim and the first order normative claim. And so the appraiser relativist could say, look, if some culture thinks it's torturing babies is good, the only thing I'm committed to is the trivial statement that it is consistent with this. Because remember the translation thing. We could translate the statements when people from that culture make it. And that people in that culture say, it's good for us to torture babies. What that means, if you're the appraiser relativist, is it's consistent with the standards of these people's culture for them to torture babies. And that actually turns out to be trivially true. It's just a descriptive claim. In other words, it's just a claim that according to people that think it's okay to torture babies, it's okay to torture babies. That's like saying, according to someone that loves to murder is great. Of course, it's true according to that person. According to a person that thinks something, they think something. I mean, the statement's trivially true, but it doesn't mean that you endorse the claim. So if I said, hey, according to that murderer, it was okay for them to murder, does that mean I think murder's okay? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. And yet, critics of relativism imply, yep, that's what you're committed to. And you're just not. You're not committed to that. So what this is a kind of cheap shot at relativism, which is intended to imply that the relativist is a terrible person that thinks it's okay to torture babies, at least under some circumstances. Maybe they wouldn't do it, but if their neighbor does it, then they are okay with that. And that doesn't follow. And notice what is being done here. The objection isn't simply, look, the relativist has a mistaken conception of the fundamental nature of morality. What they're trying to do is tarnish the relativist's reputation. They're trying to say, hey, that relativist is a piece of shit that's okay with baby torture. That's what they're trying to imply. And that's not okay. Because what they're doing is they're going after the character of the person, not the position. That's the implication. And basically, when you're presented with these objections, the objections are based on this idea that, hey, do you want to be okay? Are you okay with baby torture? If you're a relativist, you'd have to be. Yeah, you're not, then you shouldn't be a relativist. And that's just nonsense. But there's a third possibility for what realists are thinking here. And I think this actually occurs. I think William Lane Craig has made statements like this, and I've heard other both philosophers and non-philosophers think this, which is that they somehow are they're like smuggling the realism back into the relativism. So the way that some people seem to be characterizing things, and maybe this is a little uncharitable, but a lot of what people said, I'd have to dig up specific references and quotes to support this, and I think that I could. I don't have any ready on hand. Is this: if Alex thinks baby killing is good and Sam thinks it's not good, then it actually makes it the case objectively that because Alex thinks it's good, therefore it is good for Alex to do, and because Sam thinks it's not good, that makes it objectively not good for Sam to do it, as though like our beliefs somehow imbue the universe with these objective moral properties that are specific to us. So my beliefs create lancy moral goodness if I do something I think is good, but someone else with respect to the same action, if they think it's bad, it creates for them a kind of badness for performing the action. It's this kind of, it's almost like our beliefs or attitudes generate or manifest these moral properties that are somehow entangled with us in some distinctive way. For example, I could think murder is wrong, and then it would make it the case that it's objectively wrong for me to murder. It provides me with reasons, independent of anything else, for me to not murder. And you'll sometimes see people criticizing relativism characterize it as though the relativist thinks in terms of the substantive metaphysics that realists think that there is, even non-naturalist realists, where the relativist is actually just converting these moral claims into a certain kind of descriptive claim. So murder is wrong would just mean murder is inconsistent with my moral standards, or murder is inconsistent with the moral standards of my culture. That's just a descriptive claim. The relativist isn't required to and is not committed to the view that if I think murder is wrong, or if my culture thinks murder is wrong, this gives me a normative reason to not commit murder that is true independent of my thinking it so. Like that, or or in some way, maybe it is dependent on it, but so long as I believe it, like as long as I think it's wrong, like let's say you're subjectivist, as long as I think it's wrong, I have a reason. And then if I think it's not wrong, then the reasons flip or the reasons change. And there's these reasons that are somehow action guiding or normatively binding or have some sort of authority. So even if the realist isn't smuggling back in realism per se, because the realist could say, look, I'm not smuggling in realism. I'm not saying that the relativist is committed to these stance independent facts about what they should or shouldn't do. Sure, they're stance dependent. I grant that they're anti-realist, but if in virtue of their belief, they acquire normative reasons. It's just that the normative reasons are entangled with and contingent on that person's stances. But if the person thinks murder is okay, they have a reason to murder. And now if you're a relativist, you have to think that people that think it's okay to murder have a reason to murder. And that seems absurd. You're saying murderers have a reason to murder? That makes it, but so first of all, you're bringing in the weird conceptual and metaphysical issues associated with this notion of normative reasons. And the relativist isn't committed to there being these kinds of normative reasons. That's one issue. The other issue is that there's a kind of rhetorical implication that if you, as a relativist, are committed to the notion that other people have normative reasons to murder, then this, in a certain sense, you're endorsing or sanctifying that. You're saying it's good for them to murder. So it's, again, the implication is that you, as a relativist, are somehow agreeing with or endorsing other people's actions, which, again, if you're an appraiser relativist, is not an implication of your position. You're not, to put it bluntly, moral relativism does not require you to be okay with other people's actions, whatever they happen to be. It doesn't require it. It's just not true. And yet, this is one of the most central criticisms of relativism. I've gone over this at length now, so I'm going to stop and have a look at the chat. But that is something like this. What frustrates me about this is that one can raise objections to relativism without mischaracterizing it or relying on ambiguity or relying on the implication that the relativist is a bad person. None of that is necessary to argue against relativism. And yet, objection to relativism reliably fail to disambiguate appraiser and agent relativism, and consistently imply that the relativist is committed to or approves of or is intolerant or indifferent to horrible actions, and therefore they, like relativism somehow commits them to substantive, bad normative practices. And that's not necessarily true. Okay, let's have a look in the chat. Let me see what people are saying. What do we got here? Why do those people have to disambiguate agent and appraiser relativism? I'm not sure what the context was in that discussion. But why do they have to? I mean, nobody has to do anything. Like I could say conditional on the desire to accurately frame the positions they're objecting to, then they would have to do this. Otherwise, they're not accurately framing them, so it's conditional on that person's goals. I don't think people have to have my goals. Yeah, I don't know if I'd say the arguments are unsound. So what I'm not saying is that people necessarily have these formal syllogisms, and I'm pointing out the premises are false. There are often, any particular syllogism is often going to have implicit presuppositions and background assumptions that are not made explicit in the premises themselves. And often you could object to an argument on the grounds that the proponent of the argument is relying on or alluding to presuppositions that aren't made explicit in it. These professional, I don't know why it's in scare quotes. I mean, there are actual professional philosophers that do this. Yeah, so if a professional philosopher thinks that, I would just say, I would ask them to be clear on what they mean. So they endorse premises like, if relativism is true, we have to think baby torture is good. Yeah, so I would ask them, like, are they including appraiser relativism in that? Because if they are, then that's false. Like, it's just not true. And they're, if they want to dispute that with me, they're welcome to, they could come on the channel. We could talk about it. If they think appraiser relativism is committed to that, I'd want to hear why they think that and which standard they think it's like. So if they're saying we have to think it's good, yeah, that just seems to me clearly to be false. So you're saying it is an underspecified. I disagree. I think that it is. So you think I'm smuggling realism back into it? If not, what's wrong with baby torture? So it depends. We're not talking about my position here. I'm talking about what relativists are committed to, not about my position. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I don't think I'm smuggling anything in here because I'm not even talking about my own views. That's interesting. Atheist, moral, non-realist, or were they a realist? Said, without God as a standard, how can I know what I should prefer? Yeah, I almost think it's kind of a category mistake to ask what you should prefer. Well, it depends on whether you're talking about like terminal values or like, I guess you could say fundamental preferences. So let's say you have a preference for being healthy, then I would say you should prefer to not smoke cigarettes because it's not healthy to smoke cigarettes. So you could talk about sort of second order or instrumental preferences. And even if you're a relativist or an anti-realist of some kind, you could think that there's facts about those. But I don't think it would make much sense if I prefer chocolate cake over vanilla cake to say, well, which one should I prefer? It's almost doesn't make sense to me. It's not under my voluntary control. It's not the sort of like you don't choose your terminal values. So, I don't know that it makes sense to ask which ones you should prefer, especially if the should is implying that should isn't reducible to some other more fundamental fact about what you prefer. And if you're talking about your most fundamental preferences, I don't even know if it makes any sense conceptually. A lot of your stuff has gone over my head in the past, but I'm learning. Thanks, Lance. No problem. I'm sorry if some of the stuff goes over your head. All right. So other questions or anything people want to talk about? I think I covered most of what I wanted to say about relativism, and it was mainly that sort of rhetorical stuff. So if there's no questions, I think I could wrap it up there. This is a lot of fun to have so many questions and so much engagement. I really, really like it. So I guess I could say now, if you haven't already, please like the video, subscribe, put on the notification thing. I tend to set my live streams in advance, usually 2 to 3 weeks out. So you'll see those in advance. I'll also be premiering that discussion that I had on moral naturalism on this channel. I'll also be providing a link to that other channel. So when it's available, go like and subscribe to their channel. They have a few other discussions. They've talked to Kane B before. And I'm going to be rebroadcasting some of my appearances on other channels. So the first ones are going to be Bread of Life. So I've reached out and said, hey, can I put these on my channel as well? And so you get a link over to Bread of Life as well. But they'll be here. So I'm trying to get all my previous discussions. If you don't know, I spent about a year appearing on other people's channels. I did some debates. I did some discussions. I did some interviews about most of it about metaethics and moral realism. But sometimes I talked about experimental philosophy or meta philosophy and some other sorts of stuff. So, oh, thank you for the liking and subscribing and Patreon. Awesome. Yeah. You can also, if you want to support me on Patreon, I also have options for PayPal and Stripe if you want to do one-time donations. That's all totally fine. Really, for that, I want to start making more content and really do it consistently enough that it becomes like just a part of my life that I'm doing this. And I'm hoping, if people want to support me at that point, then I'll feel that I've earned it. Right now, I don't know that I've if you're throwing money at me now, thank you. But I don't know that I've really done enough yet to earn that. So hopefully, there'll be enough content on here where, if I have more than one live stream a week and I have interviews and discussions and debates and some of the old stuff that you'll see where I did previous stuff. So once I have enough content on here, I'll really feel more comfortable that I'm really doing something useful here. Okay. Oh, I see. Thanks so much for doing these. Oh, yeah. So, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Let me go back over these. A lot of your stuff has gone over my head, but you say you mean that as a compliment. Thank you. I'll take it as a compliment since that's the sense in which it was intended. Yeah. So, if something is going over your head because it's complicated or it's technical or you're unfamiliar with it, but you're learning and you come to get it, that's fine. But I also take it to be partially my responsibility to communicate the kinds of stuff that I'm talking about in a way that's clear and accessible to people. And if I start getting into like this terminology thing where I'm just blasting you with a praiser, an agent, and stance independent, people that aren't familiar with this, it might go over their head because I'm not breaking it down and being clear. So I do, if you do have feedback on ways where you have suggestions on how I could improve my clarity or convey what I'm saying in a way that's like more effective and better for people, please let me know. You could leave a comment, you could throw it in the chat, whatever you want to do to help me improve. Uh, I do know that I often talk really fast. So, and I kind of vary my speed. So if I get really excited, I might talk really fast. So I apologize for that. That I can't control very easily. That's just the way I am. So, yeah, so I do have some responsibility. See here, my earlier comment about smuggling realism is a joke, but I want to make the point that we have certain preconditions, like we can't believe one times one or one of the first. I think it looks like one times one. I don't know, and we can't believe torturing babies is good. I mean, someone I think could believe certain sorts of things I couldn't believe that I think are unbelievable. I don't know, but thank you for that remark. Okay, so yeah, I guess I guess we could wrap it up there. Well, there'll be more new content on the way. I'm not just going to keep doing these live streams. There'll be other stuff. Okay, and well, we have a lot of people here right now, so it's kind of a bummer to leave the conversation off. But I think I should wrap it up here. I think this has been enough time for me. I do want to start doing this. In fact, I guess I'll close here by asking about this. I would like to do some of what I've seen Rebecca do on Bread of Life, which is bringing people on by posting a link to StreamYard on into YouTube, and then if people want to like actually come up and talk, like I guess you could say on stage, then I would be totally up for that. If people have questions or comments or they want to have a discussion, so I'd like to gauge interest for that. Is there, like, for instance, is there anybody here? If we had more time, would you want to come up and have a conversation now, especially for people that are, whether actually, if you're here one time and you want to do it, that's fine. But, some regulars might think, oh, I'd like to come back next week and talk to you. And then I could kind of plan for that, is to make some space and some time for people to come up and do that. Okay. So I do see one person expressing interest. Cheryl, come on. What would you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about meta ethics or other sorts of topics? Oh, I see another one. Yeah, I would. Great. So tell me, what kinds, do you want to come up and talk about what I'm talking about, or are there other topics you'd want to talk about? Because I want to get a sense of like what we would be talking about, instead of just having people show up and going, hey, hi, and then like we're not talking about anything. So let me know in the chat. I see this. Why don't you attack epistemological realism too? Well, I am, another thing I should say, I'm a normative anti-realist, so I think that there are no stance-independent normative facts of any kind, and this applies to epistemology as well. I don't know. I don't see too many people arguing for it or against it, so maybe it's just less interesting to talk about. I don't see as many of the kinds of rhetorical flourishes. So I focus a lot on rhetoric and how philosophical disputes are framed. That might seem like a kind of shallow or less interesting thing than the substantive disputes themselves, but I actually think that the rhetoric creates such a substantive smokescreen that it totally muddles everything, and that much of the apparent lack of appeal of anti-realism is due to, I would say, biased framings, mischaracterizations, and rhetorical moves that I see in both academic and non-academic contexts. And when you clear away all that brush, and that's really what I want to do, I want to clear away the brush so that we could focus on the arguments. I think anti-realism just totally demolishes realism. I think realism maintains the appearance of having a stronger case for itself largely by implying anti-realism and makes you like a terrible person, and it doesn't, and that's wrong. And so I think once we clear that away, realism will lose most of its appeal, if not all of it. But I don't know. I don't see any reason to bring this up. So what will happen, you'll see me talking about epistemic normativity, and I have had arguments about it, is when people bring up companions and guilt arguments. So if you're not familiar with those, what these arguments try to do is say, if you want to reject realism, moral realism, you've got to reject epistemic realism. You don't want to reject epistemic realism, so you shouldn't reject moral realism. And it's an attempt to show that the reasons that we have for endorsing moral realism sort of sink or swim alongside epistemic realism. And sometimes people will say if you reject both, that would be self-defeating. So there's papers making that argument, and self-defeating positions, presumably you wouldn't want to accept those. I think Kane B actually has a video on that, or at least that comes up in one or more of Kane B's videos. That's what we're talking about. Oh, and Kane B, go check out that channel if you haven't already. It's an awesome philosophy channel. Anyway, so sometimes when this comes up, so my standard way of rejecting the companions and guilt argument is it has a parity premise where it tries to say that the reasons for accepting realism and moral realism and epistemic realism stand or fall together. And then it has this other one where it argues that the epistemic realism is true. So I just reject epistemic realism. I just deny that. So I take the more difficult road of, maybe it's easier. I don't know. So when that comes up, when I'm given companions and guilt arguments, I tend to go the route, because I don't typically bother with parity premises. I think you could probably reject those too, but I don't bother. I just straight up just say, yeah, I was already a normative anti-realist, so I don't have any problem rejecting epistemic realism. And then the dispute could shift over to talking about epistemic realism. But for that argument to really get going, I need a context for it. So it would need to be like, typically it's going to be non-naturalist presenting it doesn't have to be though. Typically it's going to be a realist appealing to a companions and guilt argument, and then I have to have a discussion with them. They have to present the argument. I reject epistemic realism, and then we get a dispute about that. And then it could be about whether that's self-defeating or not. I don't think that it is, of course. And other sorts of considerations. So hopefully that will take place. Let's see what else we got. I'd like to wrap up here, but let's see. I'd like to see psychological batteries on philosophers, especially moral. I hypothesize high neuroticism, high agentic thinking, high conscientiousness. I don't know if you don't know what they're talking about here. So I don't know exactly what you mean by agentic thinking, but the other two refer to big five personality traits. So that's the ocean traits. So those are personality traits. And that's a common measure of personality characteristics. So if you're not familiar with that terminology, they're using technical terms here. All right. Moral psychology. What's referentialism? I don't even know what that is. But yeah, happy to talk about moral psychology. Well, I can't think of anything philosophy or otherwise. Oh, I can talk anything philosophy or otherwise. Sorry, I totally misread that. My bad. I can talk anything philosophy or otherwise. Great. Okay. So sure. Okay. So next week, I'll make it a plan. If you're here next week, I will invite people to come onto the stage, and I'll do it, within the first half hour, so that we have time to really talk, next week. I'm not going to do it this week because I'm just about to hit 2 hours. All right. So, and then I'd want to think about the topic ahead and ask specific questions. Great. So if you come prepared, let me know. It's especially helpful if you let me know in advance. And you could even come on as a sort of semi-official guest if you'd like. I'm totally fine with that. I'd be happy to make the content more dynamic than just me talking and responding to comments the whole time. I enjoy doing that, but I'm sure anybody here would like to see other sorts of comments. Oh, correspondence theory of truth. Okay. I mean, you'll probably know more about different theories of truth than I do. I don't really study epistemology and truth a whole lot, so I might not have a whole lot to say about that. I do know that there's been a couple XFI studies that have tried to see whether non-philosophers endorse the correspondence theory of truth, and they've got these kind of difficult to interpret mixed results. So the answer seems to be it's unclear, maybe not. I love to see good thought experiments that counter realist rhetoric and intuitions. That's a good proposal. I'm not sure that I have a whole lot of those. I tend to make a more abductive and reactive case where I kind of argue for that their position is conceptually alike. So a lot of the positions I'm going to say, I'm not even sure this is meaningful. So you're going to get the Wittgenstein and ordinary language and some concerns about the concepts themselves. If you get past that, then I'm going to raise concerns about triviality. If we get past that, I'm going to raise concerns about whether it's explanatorily fruitful or useful in any way. They might just say that's irrelevant to the kind of position they're putting forward. Then we have to have a discussion with that. So there's a bunch of hurdles to cross before I would even get to the point where I would appeal to thought experiments. One case where the thought experiments become relevant to me, and this is where I do tend to use more of them. I also use a lot of metaphors and analogies, but gastronomic realism is the most common. But the most common are ones where I talk about motivation, and that's where I bring up stuff like rationally consistent Caligula, where one of the things I argue is that even if realism were true, it's unclear why I would care. So if someone says, hey, the objective moral facts are such and such, okay, well, I'm not going to do them. So too bad, unless they align with my goals and values. I mean, for one thing, and these are kind of thought experiments you could get people, what if, and it remains an epistemic possibility, if not, because moral realists might say, well, the moral facts are necessary. And I think it's necessarily true that you shouldn't torture babies. But, you could say, okay, well, it's an epistemic possibility that you could be wrong about what the necessary truths are. And it could turn out to be true that you have a moral obligation to torture babies, like an objective moral obligation. And then you can ask the question, would you do it? Now, some of them would just say the question doesn't make sense or whatever. Okay, that's a route you could go. But if they're going to accept that it's an epistemic possibility and then accept the possibility that they might have an objective moral obligation to torture babies, then I think they could, I'm looking for a response to that. Would you do it? Because my answer is no, I wouldn't, even if it were objectively true. So moral realism, kind of, if you're externalizing what you think you've got to do and you're motivated to comply with whatever those external moral facts turn out to be. Well, what if they turn out to be things, really horrible things, or like just weird things, like you have to spend all day screaming at tables? Okay, so if the realist is committed to, I will do whatever the objective facts are, and it's possible that the objective facts obligate me to scream at tables all day, then you can ask the question, okay, well, if you came to believe that you had a moral obligation to scream at tables all day, would you do it? Because I just wouldn't. And part of my problem with realism is like, okay, let's say there's these objective moral facts. Okay, I'm going to not do them. Now what? What's going to happen? The universe isn't going to strike me with a bolt of transcendent lightning. Now, apparently nothing happens to me. And, some realists will say, well, then you're not being rational. Okay, well, then I guess I'm not rational. Like, now what? Well, don't you want to be rational? Not if it requires me to do things that are inconsistent with my values. And then again, you could give them a thought experiment. Suppose you could make one of two choices. One, you act irrationally and you achieve all of your goals and you're happy and everything you value you get. Or you act rationally and you're miserable and horrible and then you die horrible and alone. Which one are you going to pick? Are you going to pick the rational one or the irrational? Because I'm picking irrational. So, if rationality doesn't end up just basically saying doing what's going to get me achieve my goals, I'm not interested. So it's telling me you're being irrational. Okay, then I'm being irrational. I don't care. I don't care about that, complying with that notion of rationality. So I don't think that, I think you can use thought experiments to question whether moral realism can really sink its teeth into us motivationally. All right. I'd like to talk about a couple structures or interviews I did where I found the moral realist indeterminacy I found same as you and others. Okay, that sounds cool. All right, you'll catch me around the chats. That sounds great. Will you make a video or blog discussing your views on language? Words don't mean things, people do. Yeah, so this is a slogan that I've started to use more frequently, which is that words don't mean things, people mean things. And so what I mean by this is that I've taken a lot of the way that philosophers speak about terms and concepts in philosophy. It's almost like they treat the words as if they have intrinsic meanings, or that words have a meaning that's independent of usage. And I don't think that that's true. So I don't actually think words mean anything. I think words are a tool people use to convey their communicative intent. And so it's not the words that mean things, it's the people using the words. And so any word can mean literally anything depending on the intent of the person using the word. Sorry. So example of this is, you can imagine, let's say I'm a spy and I need to have a code phrase to let you know that I need help. And the code phrase could be cookies and milk or something like that, or I love cookies and milk. So typical usage of I love cookies and milk in English would be in a claim about your preferences and specifically your like food and drink preferences. But I love cookies and milk, I could say to you, hey, you're listening on my secret microphone or whatever. That means like send in the special team to save me or extract me. And then I love cookies and milk means send in the special team to extract me. That's what it means, because that's what we agreed that it meant. So you could use any sentences or words or phrases to mean anything. And it's just up to the speakers what they mean. The words themselves don't have an intrinsic meaning. And so I think that people frequently, and this is a point that pragmatist philosopher F.C.S. Schiller makes, Schiller draws this distinction between like typical meaning and, these other sorts of notions of meaning. And I think that a lot of people sort of just conflate typical meaning for like some actual or intrinsic meaning. So people have weird views about language. Now, that might be a bit of a mischaracterization of what people would say if asked and what they would take themselves to be committed to. But even if that's the case, I often think that discussions slip in to this kind of usage. And you still see people occasionally saying things like words have correct definitions and a person is using a word incorrectly. And a person could be confused or about a word in a sense that they themselves would agree with on reflection. So if I wrote a text and I wrote like, I'm an atheist because I don't believe that dog exists, and someone says, I think you mixed up dog with God or something like that, a common sort of mistake that people make where they flip letters around or parts of a phrase. That sort of thing can happen. And then someone could say, I think you meant God. Yeah, I did mean God. But that's because I was mistaken about my own communicative intent. So a person can be mistaken about what they intend. They could also be mistaken about typical usage. I can incorrectly believe that when most people say something, they mean such and such. And actually they don't. So I could be incorrect about typical usage. But if the position is just, hey, look, I'm intending to mean this by this, what would it even mean to say you're incorrect? Incorrect about what? What would you even be incorrect about? That doesn't make any sense. So I almost think in some cases, the way this is used, it's almost a category mistake when people are talking about someone being incorrect about the words. It doesn't make sense. Cool. Yep, I don't know. It's just something. This is something I've just started to read about now, so I'll have to look more into it. So that's probably why I haven't really blogged about it or written much about it, because this is an area that I'm just starting to get into now. Yeah, so the receiver of the cookies and milk would have to be in on the game, of course. Otherwise, the person's not going to know what they mean, and that person might default to typical usage. So when you say the meaning is not really up to just one person, that is exactly what I'm denying. Yes, it is up to just one person. It's whatever that person intends. Now, just because another person doesn't understand them doesn't mean that's not what they intend. There's still a fact about what they intend. I don't think there's a meaning independent of what they intend. I don't even think that that's meaningful. So yeah, I would be denying that the meaning is not really up to just the one person. So I don't think that there is meaning in that sense. I think there's only communicative intent, and then there's going to be facts about whether other people are aware of your communicative intent, and whether you've agreed to use certain terms in certain sorts of ways, or whether they're making correct inferences about what your communicative intent is, that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know that we really disagree there, or it's just a question of clarification. Okay, so I've gone for over 2 hours, and I was going to do a shorter one, and this one ended up being longer. It's just there were so many questions. So thanks everybody for all the questions. I'm going to close it out here. Thanks everybody for being here today. It looks like I had more viewers today, which is awesome. So thanks so much, and I will see you all next week. And stay tuned for the extra content that'll start appearing on this channel. All right, take care, everybody. Have a great night.